I'm James Kelly, OETC's Marketing Coordinator. In today's session, we're going to talk about Azure Active Directory and hybrid identities. This session, as per usual, is going to be presented by Tyler Duncan and Garrett Chandler, Educational Technical Specialists at Microsoft. This session will be recorded and will be sent out next week, as well as posted on the OETC YouTube. If you've missed out on any of the previous webinars, feel free to check it out as well. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and both Garrett and Tyler will be in the chat throughout, so feel free to ask your questions as they come to you. However, if you have licensing or pricing questions, they will not be able to help out. Instead, please reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. Finally, we have more webinars coming up in the new year, like Cloud Native Endpoints and OETC's Volume Agreement webinar. So if you're not already signed up and would like to be, please visit oetc.org/news and go to the Winter Webinar Series, and you'll be able to register from there. And with that, Tyler and Garrett, off to you.
Thanks so much, James. Hey, everybody. So yeah, we're super excited to kind of go through Azure Active Directory and hybrid identities and to kind of show you the different types of scenarios that you might see in today's modern world. So today we'll be discussing modern identity concepts. The materials will discuss various forms of identities, both on-premises and the cloud, as well as how they integrate together. From there, we're going to move into Microsoft Entra, one of our new products that we're excited to announce, as well as how we're going to help you protect your identities with the A3 and the A5 product stack. And finally, our last agenda, we'll be going over the benefits of using Azure AD as your cloud identity provider, any different licenses required for the different various types of scenarios and features that you'll need to utilize, as well as single sign-on and connecting and provisioning other cloud providers and services. And then at the end of this, we've got some extra resources and takeaways, and we'll be going over a couple of ways to utilize this for your SC900 exam. So from here, I'm going to let Garrett take it away. And thank you so much, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, so good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're at. Thanks again for joining us today. I'm excited. This is the last webinar of the year, so hopefully you all are excited to get on the holiday breaks. To start us off, we just wanted to cover some of the basic, kind of lay that foundation of identity concepts, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how identity really is the primary security perimeter. It really is the new control plane. I think most of y'all are probably aware of that, but we'll go a little bit more in depth into that, and then we'll talk about some of the other concepts around authentication, authorization, and then we'll detail what Active Directory and Azure Active Directory are, how they differ, and what the benefits that they pose to you as an organization. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Awesome. So Azure Active Directory, this is our central access and identity management service, right? This is a software as a service platform built on Microsoft 365, right? This is what's going to give you access into the Microsoft 365 world. So if we look at it all up, Azure Active Directory is kind of the brains behind the operation for any tenant. Again, if you think about users accessing Word Online, PowerPoint, even Teams, and then getting into our security and compliance, everything is founded on Azure Active Directory, similarly to how we used to have with Active Directory, right? And so we can actually build on that foundation of on-prem technology with Active Directory. Most organizations have a vested interest in Active Directory. They've kind of started their domain with Active Directory. We're going to layer on that with Azure Active Directory, but know that it is standalone, right? You can have Azure Active Directory running up in the cloud solely and no dependency on on-prem. But we'll also use Azure Active Directory to authenticate into other applications, the cloud applications, right? Those could be Microsoft 365 services, Azure-related service, right? Anything that's under the umbrella of Microsoft, but it could also be anything in the public cloud and other SaaS applications and providers. You'll also see as we start building this out, again, Azure Active Directory is going to be that main control plane for both users and devices. So when we talk about how we can leverage Azure Active Directory for devices and bringing those into a modern world, Azure Active Directory plays an extremely critical role. And then we can even integrate into third-party identity providers, things like Ping, Okta, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So providing this, if you look at this holistically, again, Azure Active Directory is kind of the brain, which makes sense when we think about identity and when we think about secure access. Identity is that control plane, and Azure Active Directory is going to help us get there. That's kind of the foundation there. The next slide, right, I use the term identity provider. So if you're not familiar with that, an identity provider is just a system in place that will allow you to establish an identity of an object. So that could be a user or a device. And it's going to allow you to verify and authenticate those users and devices, right? So again, identity, if we think about it from a security lens, who you are, who you say you are, matters, right? If you say, I am Garrett Chandler and I want to access application A or data B or system C, there has to be a system in place to do that. And that's where an identity provider comes into play. So again, a user, application, device, all of those are commonly associated with IDPs. When we look at identity all up, right, as a concept, we kind of have 4 pillars that we want to focus on. 4 A's really. Administration, which is what Azure Active Directory will actually help you manage those identities. Authentication and authorization, we'll get into those in just a minute. And then finally auditing and making sure that you have an understanding and a record of everything that's going on in your environment. So let's drill a little bit into authentication and authorization, because this is where kind of the meat, the core of Azure Active Directory functions. If we'll go to the next slide. So authentication and authorization, they sound similar. We often have questions. There's a little bit of confusion around these two concepts. But the notion of authentication is that authentication really is the process of proving you are who you say you are. So authentication is going to grant access into a system or to a file, to an application based on who you say you are. So you can authenticate into a system and it's going to do that validation of who you are. Then we have authorization, and authorization is the next step here, because authorization is going to determine what level of access that you actually have. So once you're into the system, what are you supposed to have? And so we think about kind of new trendy terms like zero trust and things like that, where we want to ensure that our users or applications or devices work under this notion of least privilege, right? We don't want to have users who have all the rights in the world to be able to do whatever they want. And so this notion of authorization says, okay, you are Garrett. We've authenticated you. We know who you are. Now here's what level of access you're supposed to have in these respective systems. And so by defining this, we have a greater security control within our environment. That's really the difference between authentication and authorization. This next slide is a really good way to think about it too, because if you think about authentication, you can think about it in the ways of something you know. So this could be like a password. So when you're authenticating into a system and you type a username and password, that's authentication. So it's something you know. It might be something you have. So if we think about like MFA or multi-factor authentication, you might know your username and password, but you also have a secondary device or authenticator app that will ensure that you really are who you say you are, right? Or that final pillar, which is something you are, right? It could be a fingerprint, a face. This is something that's really difficult to duplicate. Only I have a fingerprint, right? And so ensuring that it's something you know, something you have, something you are, that's kind of the focus for authentication. Conversely, if we go into authorization, again, we talked about this a little bit already, but understanding what permissions you have to the apps and resources that you're actually authenticating to, the data, what level of data access do you have? Think about clearance level, and then access level just across your systems, right? If you think about roles and things like that within Azure AD, we can delegate all of that out, even down to like managing systems themselves, right? We have the ability to control the rights and permissions that you have or other administrators have into their environment, so that it's scoped. That's really the central portion of Azure AD. Next slide. So the concept of directory services and Active Directory, this is taking us back a little bit, right? I think most of you guys have Active Directory in your environment, or you're familiar with directory services. It's really just a hierarchical structure that stores information about objects on the network, right? Users, devices, applications. In most cases, you have an organization method, which are organizational units. And this is where you can start sorting or categorizing users and objects into those specific use for an organizational purpose, and help you target policies or other privileges as necessary. And so what's nice about this is Active Directory is fairly common in most domains. You have a domain likely, and it's because of Active Directory. It really is a central component that most organizations have within their IT department. What's nice about Azure Active Directory is that it's this evolution of identity and access management. And so it's actually built on top of Active Directory and our learnings from Active Directory and now a SaaS offering, right? So we can make the two talk to each other, or you could have them independent of each other if you need. But what we're getting into really is the Azure Active Directory portion today, and we'll talk about some of that evolution. So what is Azure Active Directory? It is just a cloud-based identity and access management service. If you think about it in this layered approach, right? You've got your on-premises data center today. You've got Active Directory in your environment. Azure AD integration can be stood up. We'll talk about a couple of different ways to do that, but there's leveraging a utility called Azure AD Connect. You might already have this in your environment today. If not, I think we're going to have a follow-up session on Azure AD Connect deep dive and talk about deployment and management of that. But we'll integrate Azure AD, we'll extend that schema up into the cloud, and that will start lighting your users up for access to the rest of Microsoft services online and out in the web, right? Teams and the rest of the Microsoft 365 services. If we even compartmentalize it down, not just Office 365, but even into Azure or other applications, things like that, we do have capabilities that we can extend that information out there. So it's really this layered approach. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the capabilities, but we do have the ability to manage guest users, external users for collaboration, which really makes Teams and the rest of the Microsoft suite kind of light up and shine, and helps you with your productivity. But this Azure AD is the core system that will help you manage those identities and manage the access for that. Just a couple other terms that you might hear. So Azure Active Directory is the service itself. Then you may hear the terms tenant. A tenant is just a dedicated and trusted instance of Azure AD that represents an organization. So every customer that Microsoft has, big or small, has a dedicated tenant for their organization. Think of this as a domain, if you will, kind of synonymous in that viewpoint, I guess. You've got a tenant, there's an ID associated with it, and then you can actually add custom domains. So every time you spin up a new tenant and connect Azure AD, you actually have a .onmicrosoft.com domain. That's default. You've likely, if you're using this today, you already have this, and then you'll put a custom domain. So organization a.edu or school system b.net or whatever the case may be, right? You can actually tie this custom domain to your tenant for a usability perspective, and your end users can sign on using the familiar email address that they're normal to, right? So a couple of terms, right? Custom domains, Azure AD tenant, that's what we talk about. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about Azure AD integration scenario. So I talked about layering Azure Active Directory on top of Active Directory. What does that look like? If we look at Azure AD all up as a system, it can be standalone of any independent on-prem systems. So when we think about identities that live solely in Azure AD and that there's not a user account on-prem, that's what we refer to as a cloud identity. Born in the cloud, raised in the cloud, lives in the cloud, managed through the cloud, right? No connection to on-prem whatsoever. This is awesome, right? We see a lot of newer organizations and startups, things like that, just starting here, right? Not having Active Directory on-prem at all. But for most established organizations, you'll still see Active Directory in place. That doesn't mean that you can't have user accounts living solely in Azure AD. You absolutely can. So new users being provisioned into the environment can live solely in the cloud, which is kind of nice. The next concept is this notion of synchronized identity. So synchronized identity is where Active Directory is going to be provisioned. Let's say you've got new users onboarding into your environment. They're going to procure through the HR system that's going to establish and create a new user account. Typically, that writes directly to Active Directory and provisions that new user. If that's a similar workflow that you have in your environment, then what we can do is actually take that username and password and we can synchronize that identity up into the cloud. So we can actually say that this identity has both access on-prem and in the cloud. And we'll talk about different ways that we synchronize that. But a synchronized identity is just a copy of that same identity up into the cloud from on-prem, but we're going to leave on-prem alone. And then we'll talk a little bit about federated identity, which is where we federate an identity from another IDP or something like that. We do have some capabilities there, or maybe running Active Directory Federation services in your environment. We'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation, but know that we've got these kind of three core scenarios for identities. So if you hear someone say, are these identities cloud identities? Are they synchronized identities? That's what that means. So let's talk a little bit about hybrid authentication options. So this is what we talk about when we see synchronized identities. I talked about how if you have new users being provisioned into your environment, that they live in Active Directory, and then we'll make a copy of those identities up into the cloud, into Azure AD. When we think about authentication and we think about passwords, how does this work? We've got a couple of deployment methods that we can offer up to organizations where it makes sense. So the first scenario here is the notion of password hash sync. So PHS, or password hash sync, is where we take that copy of that password that's on-prem, and we're going to replicate it up to that identity in Azure AD. So it's the same username and password for users to authenticate with, but it's just a copy. Meaning if you reset the password on-prem or change it, it may or may not, depending on your configuration, reset it for the cloud. And conversely, if you reset that password up in Azure AD, it may or may not, depending on your settings, reset that on-prem. They are independent of each other, but they're synchronized through utility. We can do password write back and things like that. So if you do reset it in one and the other, it will replicate. But just know that they are independent. They're copies of each other. There's a lot of goodness that comes if you implement this method. It's actually typically my recommendation for implementing, because if you ever lose access to your on-prem environment for whatever the case may be, it could be severe weather and there's a power outage, could be you didn't pay the electricity bill, I'm just kidding, or it could even be something more sophisticated like a ransomware attack that brings your data center down, whatever the case may be, and you lose network connectivity to your on-prem resources. If you have a copy of your password, your users can still authenticate into those Microsoft 365 services through the cloud. So just an awesome backup method to have in place and super simple to implement.
Hey, Garrett.
The next, yeah.
One thing, if I could add to this too.
Please.
So when we're syncing these passwords from on-prem to the cloud, we're not like syncing the password clear text or what the actual directory object has in there. What we're actually doing is we're actually we're putting a hash in place where it's reading that on-prem password, We're then taking that hash file, moving that up to the cloud, and then when you authenticate against that, it looks at that key, and if that key comes back as like positive, that the other key that it was matched with is successful, then we see that the password was confirmed, but we never ever take like a clear text copy of the passwords and move them up to Azure AD in that configuration. And I've had a few customers ask me about this over the past few weeks. So yes, just to confirm really quick, we're not actually taking that password on-prem and just copying it to Azure AD. We're copying that hashed copy of it, which has nothing to do with the password, and we're comparing that in a key trust relationship, and that is how the authentication occurs.
Yeah, great call out. Thanks, Tyler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The next one is pass-through authentication. So this is where we're actually going to have the authentication into cloud resources performed by Active Directory. There's a little software agent that you can deploy onto your domain controller or to another server in your environment that's got access to Active Directory. But we will actually pass that authentication directly through Active Directory to be able to authenticate into the cloud. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. Mostly from a legacy auth perspective, if you have applications that still require some of those legacy protocols, pass-through authentication is great to be able to handle that. But just know that we can do that, and if password hash sync, if that's a little, if that doesn't meet your requirements or organization's requirements, which in some cases it might not, then pass-through authentication is a great way to ensure that if you're authenticating through cloud services or authenticating to cloud services, it's going to go through on-prem. The trick there, right, is if your on-prem data center goes down and you're not able to authenticate or access any of those systems on-prem, then authentication in the cloud is going to fail as well. So just be aware of that. And then finally, federated authentication. Again, ADFS probably put in place here, or using another IDP to federate those logins. We do support that, and again, we've got some dedicated slides to that coming up. So the next slide will kind of showcase how we're actually doing this, if you think about it from an architectural perspective. So again, the user on the left-hand side is going to authenticate or type in their username and password to Azure Active Directory or any of the Microsoft 365 cloud services. And if the password hash sync is enabled, then just as Tyler mentioned, right, we've got that synchronized password that will authenticate against, that we're pulling from on-prem. If it's path-through authentication, then we'll actually go through, I don't think I've got like a laser pointer, but on the left, kind of left-hand middle of the screen, there's that notion of pass-through authentication, and we'll go through that little agent that sits on-prem and handle the authentication request, and then funnel that back up into Azure AD. And then federation is where we've got a tighter integration between the two. Exactly. Thanks for the pointer, Tyler. Awesome. Cool. Let's move on to the next one. Cool. So the concept of federation. So federation can be fairly complex, but this is a great simplified method for federating and understanding how it works. In this scenario, you can see that we've got two different IDPs. We've got IDP-A on the right-hand side, which is Azure, and then we have another IDP on the left-hand side, which is IDP-B. In this case, it says Google. So we've got two IDPs in place here. In this scenario, we have a website that's actually authenticated directly with Azure with your first IDP-A. By doing this, right, we've got like single sign-on capabilities that we'll talk about in just a minute with Azure Active Directory. This is where this website is actually integrated directly with Azure AD. Now, you have a user whose primary IDP that's associated to them is Google, in this case, IDP-B. And so if the user attempts to authenticate to a website that is integrated into IDP-A, typically this isn't going to work because the two IDPs are separate from each other. But with federation, we actually establish a trust between the two IDPs, right? And there's a secure way of doing this. And typically it's token based, but once you establish a trust between the two IDPs, then that user who might be aligned with IDP-B can then authenticate through IDP-A into that website and grant access, right? And it kind of becomes a circle. So when that user's credentials are passed to the website, it trusts and allows access. So we can think about this in a couple of different ways, right? We can think about this as two IDPs. We can think about this as on-prem and in the cloud, depending on the resources that you're trying to access. Federation can mean a couple of different ways. We've seen a federation kind of pop up a little bit more recently. I think this is a great example because you actually can federate Google Identities with Azure AD and pass that authentication through, so you can sign into Google services using your Office 365 account, essentially, or your Azure AD account, so that we're bringing that single sign-on capability to those users, but it really is just a federation. Tyler, is there anything that you wanted to add here? Did I hit on that?
Oh, yeah, 1 second real quick. So one big thing about this that we think about is because we have so many different identities spread in so many different environments, it's oftentimes something to think about long term. Like a lot of our educational sectors will have downtime during the summer of 2 or 3 months in some cases to go, and they have the ability to go through these large scale changes, or at least to start testing things. And so it's important to understand that we know that this isn't going to be like an overnight flip of a switch type of thing, but once you kind of get the foundational layers and understanding how the identities work and understanding what's available to you in your organizations, you can really start to structure and build a lot of that automation, because a lot of us struggle with, and I was guilty of this too as a tech director for many years, I might have only had 15,000 actual students that were active, but I had 36,000 Google accounts. Or on the Microsoft side, I might have 15,000 active students, but really I've over licensed and paid for 16,000. And there's all these different situations that we run into because we've got all of our identities kind of spread across all of these different products. And so once that starts to happen, and once everything starts to fragment like that, it's really, in my opinion at least, time to start to think about, like, how am I going to make this identity centralization easier on myself as an IT admin? Because at the end of the day, if we've got that many students and that many staff members, and I am on a team of 5 or 6 people, and we're constantly having people that have login issues, they don't understand which one to use for what situation, they've got 2 MFAs deployed, Duo for one, the Microsoft MFA for another, we get into this crux of a situation where it's so fragmented all over the place. And so it's really kind of, in my opinion, time to start thinking about, all right, maybe we need to start to figure out how to centralize our IDP, how it federates with our other systems, and automate the management of how it creates those accounts, how it disables them, how it offloads them, and how it retires them. That way we get back to a good kind of, security posture where we're regularly cleaning and automating account transitions. Because otherwise, like I said before, we end up with thousands and thousands of accounts in all these systems, and those systems do cost money, especially on the storage side. And so it's not really realistic to try and run like that, like over the future decades. And so now that some of us are in the infancy stages when we're looking at this for the first time, it's a good idea to think about this and how you're going to integrate all your systems together long term, and then make it easier for your users long term as well. Because once you get your security policies designed and created with IDP-A, and then set up federation with your other systems, they have to adhere to those same security protocols and compliance pieces that you've set up, which once again makes it so much easier for your IT staffers to be able to centralize the management of this. When you have some major issues starting to come through and accounts are being hacked, you don't want to have to go to 5 or 6 different systems, go to the user accounts, toggle them off, reset the passwords, see what happened, and then try and repair the damage. Like, it's really just at this point like a good time to start to think about, hey, I've got all these different systems I have to integrate with. I know there might be a little bit of pain to work through getting the initial integration put together, but over the long run, it's going to save me so much time and effort that I can give back to those students. That was just what I was going to bring up real quick, Garrett.
No, love it. Awesome. So again, kind of just like what Tyler said, right, from a security posture perspective, right, you want to consolidate those identities, and then from a from all the different identities across all the applications that your end users are using, right? That's where single sign-on comes into play. And so just know that Azure AD has thousands of pre-integrated apps that we can integrate with, Google being one of them, Adobe, Apple School Manager is another one, Salesforce, ServiceNow, right? We got all of these apps pre-built within the Azure AD template so that you can go and provision those and start centralizing your IT management or identity management. And then, and Tyler will actually get into some of those security controls that we talked about, like conditional access and privileged identity management, things like that. All of those come into play once you centralize those identities across the whole stack, right? All these services that you integrate. So we've got a lot of pre-built ones. If we'll go to the next slide, this is really, again, just more of an architectural overview of how the authentication works through Azure AD. Again, you'll have your HR systems or SIS systems integrated directly into Azure AD for provisioning. You may do that with Active Directory and then sync those user accounts into Azure AD. But then you also have those external identities such as Google and other services that may classify as an IDP as well. And then once you have all of that integrated into Azure AD, then we can do single sign-on into the various apps. What's nice is that you can do single sign-on for certain apps, and let's say ServiceNow, for example, you could configure the single sign-on for ServiceNow in Azure AD without having user accounts or anything into Azure AD yet. So you can do a lot of the prep work if you're looking into this. You can do a lot of that prep work up front. And so then when you get devices or get identities into Azure AD, then they'll have access to those other systems. And this works across cloud-hosted apps, etc. The other thing that we wanted to call out was this notion of Azure AD App Proxy. It's a little outside the scope of today's call, but if you have on-premises applications that you want to single sign in as well, we don't always need Azure AD Federation services or anything like that in place. We can actually light those capabilities up through the Azure AD App Proxy, which is a simple agent that you can deploy and configure on those systems, and that will actually grant access through Azure AD. So that same username and password, we can do single sign-on into those legacy applications. That if they're just on-prem and require access or line side to the DC, you can then do that from the cloud perspective. So we do have some cool capabilities there. Azure AD, if we'll go to the next slide, it is built on open standards. I think that's one of the
real
coolest.
Quick, Garrett. One thing I did want to bring up. So I know we've got the HR systems on the left hand of the slide. And so one thing I want to kind of bring up in the ADU side, I know a lot of us kind of deal with environments that don't exactly have the best HR systems integrations. We're probably dealing with like a bunch of PowerShell scripts that run nightly, that pull it out of whatever on-prem systems that you might have, or you might have a cloud version of it that you're integrated with, where it runs a task scheduler, and maybe it's like a Python file that runs every night. And so I did want to kind of go into a little bit more depth into how this might work in the future. So we understand that those different HR systems are sometimes complex, or things aren't updated frequently, and they're not kept up to date as much as you would like. But it's kind of important to notate that really clean information about what people do in terms of job titles, departments, office locations, and other things like that. At the very base level, at least getting those types of integrations set up and working functionally and getting that information up to date regularly, that will enable you to automate a lot of the processes that you're having to deal with today, where you're manually adding permissions assignments. You're manually adding someone to a shared Google Drive or a SharePoint site. Like, you can get yourselves to a point where once you work through a couple of different steps with your HR systems and you start synchronizing that data, you can create those dynamic groups and those other different systems that can automate those tasks to make that a lot easier for you long term. Because one of the biggest things I struggled with as an IT admin on the other side was every time I would get all these requests in my ticketing system, I need access to this, I need access to that. Well, it's over in this system, and it's over in that system, and I need this by tomorrow, and if not, we're not going to be able to do our presentation. And I can't tell you how many times I would want to pull my hair out, try to figure out all these different people that all needed to have access, just for someone to say, well, actually, these people also need access too, or ooh, we shouldn't have done that. Like, I was always kind of like on the fly and on the seat of my pants type of situation. And what I really liked is once I worked through the HR systems integrations and once I got a lot of this stuff standardized, it made my life a whole lot easier as an IT admin, because a lot of those situations, as those calls and those tickets that were coming in, they were no longer a problem because the system automatically moved someone from one permission set to another. Say originally they were a principal, or sorry, say originally they were a teacher and now they're a principal and they're a principal of this building. Well, I don't want to have to sit here and think of the 4 or 5 drives that probably got to give them access to do their jobs. I'm just going to have the automated workflows in place that says, hey, they're a principal at this building with this access, so they're going to have access to this SharePoint site, access to this folder with finance, and they're going to have the ability to send out, messages and Teams chats and everything else to the entire district or that building, rather than just between the teachers. And so you can build policies and security around all of that, because we also know too that securing these environments and trying to work through all of this, it's a step-by-step process. We had our last conversation in our last meeting where it was all about like cybersecurity. It's all a journey. And the more of this information that you can get connected, and the more federation and the more connections to other systems that you can automate, the less time that you're going to have to deal with that as an IT admin, and the more time that you can give back to students and staff, and hopefully get to a point where you don't want to rip your hair out all the time. Thanks, Garrett.
Awesome. Just know for this slide that we support open standards. So SAML 2.0, OAuth 2.0, OpenID, we support those protocols. So as long as your application supports those, from a security perspective, from an authentication perspective, we've got support for that. And again, Azure AD, once you integrate those applications, and I think on the next slide, we actually highlight how quick and easy it is to integrate those applications. We've got a pre-built database, of those, or an app gallery, if you will, of those applications that we can go through and integrate. And so a lot of those are pre-built, but if you have another system out there that you want to integrate through SAML or something like that, we've got full support there. So, yeah, I think that's all that is on my end, unless I would have anything to add.
No, Garrett, that was everything on your side. Thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It gives us a really good, strong concept of identity, I feel, so that we can kind of understand, where we were before, where we are now, and hopefully where we can be in the future. So now kind of expanding upon this, we've discussed all those identities and how they all integrate between all those different systems, but we never really talked about, how are we going to protect those identities, and how are we going to make sure they're compliant, and how are we going to make sure that we've got those policies and procedures in place, and that automation I was talking about earlier, where those accounts have a lot of those situations taken care of automatically, and reducing my time as an IT admin or an IT staffer trying to take care of those different systems. So we do have a new product called Microsoft Entra, and we just announced this at Ignite this past year. And so it's really big bread and butter is that it is now, and this is where it might get confusing for a split second, but Microsoft Entra now has Azure AD as an umbrella underneath it. So almost think of Microsoft Entra as the centralized, like long-term identity management platform that has every kind of automated feature towards identity and protecting it. You can use this to protect access to apps or resources, securely and verify every single identity that's brought into your environment. If you're in situations, or if you're a college or institution that needs to have some of that, those extra identity validation procedures put in place, this system can definitely help you with that. Well, another big kind of concept that we'll go over here in a little bit. So provide only necessary access when it's needed. So Garrett was talking about this earlier. I know previously in a lot of our environments, it was easier just to give everybody admin rights to things. Like, we don't want to have to deal with people asking for permissions. We don't want to have to deal with the influx of the tickets and things that are going to go on in that area. But we've kind of now noticed over the years that giving everybody admin rights probably wasn't the best way to go, and it's probably bitten us in the butt a few times. So I know a lot of us have probably moved more towards an environment where it's a standard user access and things have to be elevated from here. And just think of Entra as another evolution of that, where you have more access controls across more control planes. Since Microsoft Entra can actually work with different providers like AWS, Google Cloud, in terms of identity, like for the first time, it's one broad perspective identity platform that's centralized in the M365 systems. So once again, we see Microsoft's commitment to one single pane of glass for security, compliance, monitoring things, account automation. Like we're really, really pushing towards that initiative. And then finally, at the end of the day, that's what always makes our lives a lot easier, is to simplify that experience, to make that a lot easier, to use the intelligence type of systems that Microsoft has learned over the years and adapted for us to use, but utilize those in our environments. That's really where we want to be long term, is to simplify this whole identity user provisioning experience with all of our different customers. So it is the new product family name for identity and access products, as I was saying before. And like I was saying, it is now an overarching umbrella over Azure AD, because remember, Azure AD is the identity service that's core to the Microsoft products. But obviously you have identities in other different areas and other different systems. So Microsoft Entra has the ability to tap into those and tie into them, so you have a centralized single pane of glass to see what's going on in terms of identity. We've been working on this for many years now, and we were finally excited about this because we were just running into so many issues where a lot of different identities were fragmented. And like I was saying earlier, we had that issue where one system might be getting breached, but another one might not be. But because no one in domain B was reporting anything, you don't have metrics that accounts are starting to be attacked and things are happening to them. Whereas if you have the integration pulled together, Microsoft Entra can help kind of deal with those situations and help you remediate those problems. If you have A5 security on top of Entra with this, you can use all those risk score based methods and say, hey, I've noticed that this account has been breached. It was logged into China multiple times. They need to go through the they need to go through the password reset procedure, and they need to re-auth with MFA, for example. And it automates a lot of those tasks, because I know a lot of you have dealt with those situations where you get a call from a teacher, my account's been hacked, I can't do anything, I don't know what's happening, but all these locks are appearing on all my files, I need you to fix it, and I need you to fix it now. Well, we know in that situation, if it's just that one teacher, we've got to go in, manually reset the password for them, call them, get it up to date, make sure they know over the phone what it is, get them signed back in, and then try and look at what damage was done and see what access was done. Like, it takes a long time to do that. Well, think about what happens if that happens to scale and you've got multiple teachers that were hit by something at the same time. It's very difficult to try and go into all those different systems, see what happened, and then try and integrate and get a report on it. Entra can help fill in that gap for you amongst all your different identity services. Now, what does it actually do, and what is it supposed to implicitly do between all of our different technologies? So it directly integrates with Azure Active Directory as well as other third parties. It's supposed to help you protect your users, apps, workload, and devices, because keep in mind, identity is where all of this starts. So if there's already something that's compromised or hinky about the identity to begin with, then we already need to be suspicious about what permissions and access we're giving to users, apps, workloads, and devices. And because of those metrics that we're ingesting, we're going to see things like, oh, well, they've signed in for multiple different devices in the past 5 minutes. That's probably not normal for a standard person to be able to be signed in from 10 different devices. Oh, well, we probably need to restrict their access temporarily, or need to figure out what's going on. And then you can set different levels of restrictions based on how you want it to work. So say if that's suspicious, we set it to where they can only access these certain systems until they're compliant or their identity is 100% trusted again. And then from there, we also have verified ID. Now, verified ID is similar. So you know how where we have passports and other different systems that validate us from the photo perspective as who we are, and that ties us back to our social security number. Well, we have verified ID that's part of Entra, and as your identities are validated as part of this system, you can utilize this platform to more or less prove to the rest of the world, hey, this is a Microsoft immutable ID. We've got our security protections in place. We've got these things implemented. It's trusted. It's validated. And then you can use that to show other platforms that you're running all of those processes to keep your accounts protected. Now, we typically will probably see a use case for this more so on the business side, but I did want to mention it because we do have some higher educational schools that definitely run into situations where they have to work with other business partners, law firms, and other institutions like that. And this is where the Entra verified ID can definitely be beneficial or helpful in those situations. When you have to integrate with a lot of those, those very high, law firms that are out there, and you've got to exchange information, and they want to make sure that the identities that are being used are following every different security permission that they have to abide by. This gives you those metrics to prove to them that you're following that. Now, there's a different approach to thinking about permissions, and I wanted to kind of go through this and break it down. So previously, we would grant permissions based on job roles and responsibilities, which is where we really would like you to be initially during this transition. But once we get to there, we need to think about, okay, well, now that's implemented, but I still need to increase my cybersecurity hygiene. I still need to make improvements on my identities because there's still occasional issues where people are getting through. So now you're thinking about granting permissions based on historical usage and activity. And what that means is if somebody's been given admin rights, but they've never used it, you probably need to know about that so you can remediate that problem, because if they're never using those admin rights and that's open on that account, that's a security posture advantage where if you locked that down, that account is no longer a vector to attack your institution. And I know it's a new concept of thinking like that, but we just have to think about it. If people aren't using some of these admin permissions, it's not a regular occurrence. We've just given it to give it to them. Like, we need to start thinking of maybe a just-in-time type of access scenario where they need those permissions through an approval system, not where we're just granting them carte blanche access to it. Now, from there, usually the admins would manually grant the permissions, and it had no time restraints on it. You added them to this folder, always instantly had access to it until the end of time. Well, if you tie all these systems together, you can set it to where you only allow temporary access to those systems if it's something that you really need to protect, and that they have to go through some extra validation measures to make sure they can access those data sets. You can have it check on things like, is their Defender working? Is their compliance for the devices, green and in good standing? Has there been any identity anomalies over the past month on their account? There's so many different layers of different data types that you can ingest to create policies and procedures to take care of those situations, to where you're giving people access when it's needed, not permanently just this is how it's been assigned and this is how it'll always be assigned. And then finally, permission cleanup was done manually in a lot of our systems in the past, where we had to go through, like I was saying earlier, like someone was previously a teacher, now they're a principal. Now I got to go through and change all those permissions because maybe that principal doesn't need access to all the same things some of the teachers did, or maybe they were on like different team sites that had access to different materials. And now this new principal doesn't want to see all that stuff the first time they sign in because that was what they saw when they were a teacher previously. So with Entra, we can use that system to automate a lot of that, see a lot of the creep where those permissions are starting to pile up, and then it gives us metrics to say, hey, this person's had all these permissions built up over the years. They probably shouldn't be using all of that. Here's where we can start peeling back those layers and fixing a lot of those vectors of where someone could get into an account and cause harm. Because keep in mind, that principal now has been granted additional access probably before they were a teacher. Now, I know we have situations where a principal might go back to be a teacher in the future. Well, what do you think about it, or what happens to those situations where they've had all that principal access, but now they're a teacher again, and that's all been left wide open, and that principal and that teacher account, because they're disgruntled, they're not too happy, they don't really care, their account was the one that got breached. Well, they weren't a principal anymore. They don't have to care or worry about that part, but the permissions were still there that still gave them that type of access. So kind of think of this system as a nice way to be able to show you where that creep over time is occurring and where you can make policy changes to help improve your environment. Now, this next slide really kind of breaks down what that looks like. The authorization systems, how it integrates together, what it looks like, and you can see like here's like the inactive roles, the different things that you're seeing in the system. Here's high profile targets that might be targeted, and you might want to make sure you have better policies in place. Like, it really gives a great broad perspective across all your different identities, across all your different platforms. You also get detailed usage analytics cover every action prevented that was performed by an identity. So remember earlier when I said it gets really difficult. Say someone did get breached. Now you got to go out to all these different systems to see what was affected, what was changed, what happened. Because the ransomware, somebody hit, a shared, OneDrive, and now everything was ransomware and encrypted. If this system is enabled and properly deployed, you're going to have the real-time analytics of what was changed, when, and how, and if any data was offloaded from those systems, and the IP addresses that they were sent to. This is huge compared to where we were before, because before we could get some basic metrics on, hey, this is what's occurred, these are the IPs that it went to, but every single action that was all nicely and neatly knit together for us, that gave us a nice report to see exactly what happened and what objects were changed. It gives us that nice granular layer, because we know the insurance companies are probably going to ask about that. We know that they're probably going to, well, what was breached? What did happen? What was ransomware? This gives you that nice report to understand what happened, how it occurred, and then also to help work with cybersecurity teams to remediate it. The more data that they have of what happened, the better that your cybersecurity teams can react to those situations. Like I was talking earlier, we can use this to automate those least privileges policies. Now that we've got a number of metrics pulled in place that we're seeing, that we're ingesting, we can say, hey, they need that access, but it's just in time. So, they'll get approval quickly from the IT department. And you can set it up to where it's like a Teams ping or an email, or however you want to set it up in the system. You go in, whoever set with that approval flow goes in, approves it. It temporarily gives them that admin access. And then once that's done, it peels that layer back. And it's really nice to be able to centralize that across all your different identity platforms. Because I know a lot of us, we might need to give, say, some contractors access because we need them to do work, and we need them to we need them to have access to our systems. But I know a lot of us struggle with the fact that we've got all these contractors that we brought in over the years, and we've just set them up in our domains, we've given them full account access, we've given them licenses, and we've just set them up as global admins. Well, as we've seen with a lot of breaches and what's happened in a lot of environments, those are typically the accounts that are targeted first when some sort of malicious actor is trying to get into an environment, because it knows, hey, it looks like this account hasn't been used in 6 months, but it has full admin rights. So I'm going to start hitting that one first and targeting that because nobody's probably watching it. And I'm going to get into that account and do my malicious type of actions. So Entra can help you automate all of that as well when you have those contractor positions. So that way, every 30 days, it automates this, goes through, double checks it. If they didn't approve or get their new just-in-time access or hit that approve button, then you know that they probably aren't working there anymore. Shut down the account, deny the access, peel back the permissions, automate all of that. That way you no longer have to question that situation anymore. Just a great system to kind of deal with a lot of those scenarios. The other piece with this too is you can grant identities permissions on demand for a time period of an as-needed basis. And what that looks like in the system is you set it up, and then you get a pop-up of Teams notification, email, however you want to set up in the system, or you can directly go into this portal and then just approve it. And you can set up certain people that are approvers. Another big thing is monitoring and learning. So now that we've got all these additional metrics being pulled in, and we've got centralized across all of our different identity platforms, we can create customizable alerts to tell us things when they're going on. You don't want the user to be the one that's calling you, telling you that their account's being hacked if you can prevent that. You'd like to have a system in place that'll go through, automate a lot of those usage patterns, and then you can create alerts that say, hey, we're noticing an uptick on your Google environment, and there's all these logins on all these accounts, and they're not successful right now, but you probably need to be aware that somebody is currently trying to breach your environment. Or the same on the Microsoft side, where you can come in and see that real-time data of where it's all collated together and understand, like, hey, this is something that we really need to worry about, and this is something where we really need to be concerned. It helps strengthen your security posture. Remember, cybersecurity is a journey. It's not overnight. This is just one of those extra tools that will help you towards those initiatives. And I included this slide in here in case anybody wanted to play around with the environment. They wanted to have a little fun with it, see what they could do. We actually have a test environment that you can go through and play with this, and you're not going to break anything in this test environment. But it's really nice because it gives you a nice way to kind of see, hey, what does it does? How can I integrate it? What type of data is it going to give me? You know, this is a really great tool to kind of show you what you would get from the product. So I just wanted to include that. And we will be sharing this PowerPoint out like we have the others at the end of this conversation. All right, so I did include this slide because I know a lot of our customers get really confused, like, man, Microsoft security is really ballooned. It's kind of all over the place. How does this even break down anymore? So I wanted to kind of break down the different product categories and really what they cover. So identity going forward, that main overarching umbrella will be called Microsoft Entra. When we're talking about security, the two overarching umbrellas are going to be Microsoft Defender and Sentinel. With compliance, that's going to be Microsoft Purview. With privacy, it'll be Microsoft Priva. And then management will be Microsoft Intune or co-management scenarios. So I just really quickly wanted to break down what all these different categories were and who and what kind of overarching umbrella kind of covered what, because I know you've been all curious of, well, I'm interested in compliance. What is that even under? Well, you'll know to go look up information about preview and compliance and how that works in our environments. Now, I know we've seen these slides many times, but I wanted to include these real quick because this is the breakdown of everything that you would get in A3. But what I did for us to make this a lot nicer, I included a breakdown of every protection I'm aware of for identity that's included in your M365 A3 bundle stacks. Because I know a lot of you like, well, I've already purchased A3, but I don't even know what that's going to do for me. So this will give you Purview Standard, you know, Advanced Threat Analytics, Office 365 Cloud App Security. So I really broke down all the different nitty-gritty pieces that I'm aware of from an identity perspective that'll be really helpful for you in your environments. And these are all available to you today if you are purchasing and paying for M365 A3. Same thing for A5, where we've got that full breakdown, what's all included in it. And I also did this, where I also included the same thing like A3, but the few slides after this, I'll actually be going through some of how these more advanced systems can help automate and protect your environments. Say Microsoft Entra isn't like a good time for you right now. You need to start leveraging what you've already purchased today and proving to administration that it's doing everything that you need it to do. I wanted to make this really easy to kind of break down what each of these products could do for you. And so under the M365 A5 product stack, you know, we get Defender for Identity, we get for Defender for Office 365. And remember those pillars that I was bringing up before, Defender also breaks up into a separate sub-umbrella underneath it, which is Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office 365. And those are the three kind of overarching breakdowns that Defender covers and what it covers in the Microsoft platform. Now, some other big features that you get with A5 is privileged access management, privileged identity management, which is PIM, entitlement management, as well as SIEM connectivity with identity to your other different solutions. So you can still connect. Say you're using CloudStrike right now and that you've paid for that product for the next 5 years and you're really stuck in that agreement. If you go down this product path, you can still integrate with some of those third parties. That way you can still get that centralized pane of glass, even if you've already paid for a subscription to another product for an extended period of time. Now, the one thing that you get with the A5 kind of piece that you've purchased or the security add-on is Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. And really what this does is it's kind of a system that goes through and it gives you insights on what it's seen from the identity perspective. So with the base A3 platform, it'll just show you like, here's the sign-in location data, and it'll say whether or not there might be a potential issue. Whereas with Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, what it'll do is it actually goes through and gives you reports. Hey, here's accounts that are being signed into. Based on our heuristics engine, we have noticed that these accounts are probably being hacked or there's something going on with them, and you need to go through and deal with this. And gives you auto remediation procedures to kind of help deal with that situation. You can use this to give yourself alerts. You can also set up auto remediation procedures to where, you know, hey, if this is a really huge risk because this is how the system's assigned it, they need to go through the full password management, the full password piece where they're having it reset. They need to readjust their MFA and go through that full setup again. And if it really is a continuous problem, maybe they need 3 levels of identity verification rather than 2, because that user has been in such risk before. And this will give you all those different type of data sets that you're going to need to be able to make those types of calls to kind of help those situations as they arise. And we've got these risk-based policies to where we can say, you know what, if this is some sort, like what I was talking about earlier with Purview, where you can see those attacks coming in, with Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, as you see those different types of those hacks that are coming into your environment, you can use this to remediate things and say, hey, during this time, I'm going to set it up to where only these trusted locations can access our materials for a time being, because whatever this is, it's really trying to hit us, and I need to try and block this at the firewall or wherever else I need to from a security perspective. But at least I can keep my core environment safe and secure. And that's really where Azure Active Directory Identity Protection is really going to help you in those situations. Now, that is only included in A5. You get some base metrics in A3, but A5 is really where it's going to help with the automation. It's going to help, with it's going to give it a risk score that you can use to sit there and set up automation. And so this is really only a feature that's mostly in A5. Now, the other part that you get with this is the user risks, and that's what I was talking about earlier with this. So you see this risk level, medium, medium, medium. Okay, they had 6 sign-ins from this location, whatever. You can use that to create those steps with A5 to auto-remediate that. They've now had too many sign-in attempts that were incorrect, so now they got to go through a password reset. The next piece that's really important with A5 is privileged identity management. And this is really big for accounts that have like global admin rights, SharePoint admin rights, Intune admin rights, Exchange Online admin rights. Now, I know in the past, it's been typically easier just to give those people those global admin rights and just have it on permanently. They always have access to it. They can always use it whenever they need to. Well, where we've kind of been seeing a lot of accounts getting hacked lately is they know that those IT accounts are probably the ones that have access to do those types of permissions. So then in some cases we've seen where they try to target those accounts specifically. Well, privileged identity management is able to come in and, similar to what Entra can do, but with that just-in-time access when it comes to admin permissions, where you can set up templates and it'll say, hey, this person has global admin rights, but only during this time, for example, during business hours. Or we can even take it a step further than that and say, all right, well, they're eligible for it, but somebody else needs to approve it before it activates and they can use it. And once that's approved and activated, they can only use that permission for, say, an hour or 2 hours, however you want to set it in the system. And this is really nice because it gives you a nice workflow system that allows you to give people admin permissions when they need it to, but then peel those layers back when they don't. So that way, in case their accounts do get compromised, you don't have to worry about what the hackers or whoever's gotten into those systems have kind of messed up and affected in your environment. Because if they've only got basic standard access on that account, then the worst they can probably do is change the OneDrive files of that user account. Whereas if they have those full admin permissions of all those various systems, now you're talking thousands of accounts that can potentially be, taken advantage of. So PIM is a really nice feature of A5 that, if fully utilized today, can help protect your environment. And this next slide right here just kind of shows what that looks like. If they're like, whether or not they're eligible for it, like the alerting and stuff like that. It's just really nice. And then it also gives you an audit history. So that way, in case, a breach did occur and someone was able to get through all of this, you can go into the audit history and say, this was when your account was elevated, this is when you were attacked, and this is what was a result of it. So it's really nice in terms from like the administrative perspective of what happened with your admin accounts. It really makes it nice to manage those different systems. Now, we did talk about this the last time, but I wanted just to include this really quick in here. If you move up to the A5 product stack, you do get Microsoft Secure Score. And when you integrate it with all these different systems, because remember, identity is something that we want to protect and we want to improve on over time. Like, this is definitely something that we want to utilize if we have access to it. Now, in this area, this is just kind of one big Azure Active Directory features, because I know a lot of us we're still new to this in some areas. We're just not sure really what it is, or we're using it, but we don't even fully understand like how it works. So I really tried to give like a breakdown of like how it works, like Cloud Directory, like connect on-premises directories to Azure AD. It supports multi-forest, like, because I got a lot of questions like these over the past few months of like, hey, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? Like, so I tried to break this down to kind of give you a good, like, here's what a lot of this means. And one of the big things too I included in here is the enterprise SLA of 99.9%, or 8.76 hours per year. So I know a lot of our educational customers have come to me and said, well, I'm not sure I trust Microsoft and Azure AD. What if Azure AD goes down? Then I can't authenticate, and now none of my environments work. Whereas if I keep it with my on-prem domain, I can control that, and I have absolute control, and I can always make sure that it's up and running. Well, Microsoft's SLA for Azure AD is 99.9%, which means we can only technically have a downtime for 8.76 hours. After that, Microsoft isn't reaching their SLA requirements, which means, in some cases, people might get credits back. And so Microsoft really, really, really wants to hit that target of only 8.76 hours of downtime per year for the entire environment. Now let's compare that to a quick second of your on-premises environments. If you went down and you've been down because someone ransomware your servers and you've been down for 2 weeks, well, that's a huge amount of time that was lost compared to where if it had happened in Azure AD and you can utilize all these security systems and stop it as it's starting. Well, now you've protected the environment, and now you're not spending as much time trying to restore what's happened, from an account perspective that's been hacked. So it's really nice to think about that. If you do that integration, yes, you do take a slight chance where you do rely on Azure for those authentication requests. But Microsoft's really improved that. We're a worldwide global entity. If our systems start to shut down, it's not just you that's affected, it's a lot of others. So also think of it from that perspective as well. And I just wanted to kind of preface this with what we were talking about earlier. It is really nice to be able to manage the passwords, the integration, and everything all from one centralized server through Azure AD out to your different public clouds. A lot of our customers struggle with this. It's really difficult. They always, well, my Google accounts are this, my Microsoft accounts are that, my AW accounts are that, and they're all different domains, and I always have a hard time with my students, and they can never get signed in. Like, just try and think about this long term, and feel free to reach out to us and have these discussions, and we can work on helping you work through those larger scale discussions of, hey, I'm here, and I want to be here. How do I get there? And in this piece right here, I pulled together of what it shows how you integrate with all the different services. But what I also did on the left-hand side here is I included the deployment guides to like Google SSO, Google Federation, Canvas SSO, Adobe Federation. Like, a lot of those systems are primarily used in EDU, and I just wanted to make sure you were aware that we have documentation that shows you how to set this up. So in case you weren't aware of this before, there's documentation here that will be provided to you that'll help you go through these different integrations. And then finally, I included an additional resources page here. And this breaks down a lot of the different programs, like Fast Track, for example, if you're not aware, that can help you with onboarding some of this. If you do pay for M365A3, Fast Track can help you with some of the MFA questions that you have. They can help you with the initial pieces where you want to turn this function on and know what it does. They can walk you through and explain that. I've also included the Dev Center underneath here. So I know a lot of you like to play in simulated sandbox environments. You don't want to mess with your production environment. The Dev Center gives you the ability to do this, and you can do this on your personal accounts at home. This isn't restricted to like your educational accounts. But this gives you the ability to go through and create your own little dev environments, work through and play with it, and just kind of get a good full experience of what you're kind of dealing with. And it'll activate various license keys to give you access to those various features so that you can test them. I included the Entra preview here, the Azure AD overview, the Azure AD Connect prerequisites, in case those of you that haven't started down that path yet. I also included the services descriptions of the M365 platform and specifically what's included amongst all those different SKUs and what you get out of it. For community resources, I've included the Microsoft Mechanics forums in their YouTube series, which is actually great. If you ever have some downtime, I always recommend it. And then finally down here on the bottom right-hand corner, now that Garrett and I have gone through this with you, kind of done this training, have done these explanations, it's now I can now actually tell you that the content that we've gone through is a decent amount of what also is available in Microsoft Learn. So if you are working towards your certifications, and this is something that you want to be able to take to your bosses or say, hey, I now have my my certification for this. I've included the links to the study guide and the exam, and feel free to go out to the website and take the exam if you'd like. But a lot of the information that we covered today will also help you pass those exams. And then finally, we've got our thank you and our survey here. And I just wanted to make sure that we were all aware that this is here. I do really use this to get a lot of feedback and metrics from our different customers out there. And this really helps me kind of gauge, hey, here's where we did good, here's where we did bad. Here's the ones that actually want to talk to our DSRs and get some assistance from people. So if you have questions, you have concerns, you want somebody to reach out, please, please, please fill out this survey. We'd really, really appreciate it.